All new episodes of Game Graveyard. Weekdays on RatedEm.
Esports has been around since the dawn of competitive video games, and over time has grown to a massive industry, with countless players and millions of fans. However, many games have had huge esports scenes only to suddenly vanish. What happened to these huge competitive spaces for some of the most celebrated multiplayer games of all time? So, what happened to these dead esports games? I want to first start off with one of the first big esports games, Quake. Quake is a 1996 first-person shooter and a successor to id Software's Doom. It's fully 3D and has an even bigger emphasis on movement compared to its predecessor. Many maneuvers seen in competitive games now, like bunny hopping or strafe jumping, originated from Quake alongside rocket jumping. The game's unrealistic, fast-paced nature was a huge appeal to players. While many people hosted local LAN tournaments for both Doom and Quake was one of the first games to have a large-scale corporate-funded tournament solely based around the game. Red Annihilation would be one of, if not the first modern esports tournament focused on a shooter game, where 2,000 players would compete in a 1v1 elimination tournament. The winner, Dennis Fong, would be awarded John Carmack's personal Ferrari. If you don't know who John Carmack is, you're probably too young to be watching this video. Go back to playing Warzone or Fortnite or whatever it is you kids do. Quake would go on to get a few sequels, such as Quake 2 and Quake 3, the latter being multiplayer only. There was also Quake 4, but it was extremely underwhelming. Quake 3 would see some success when it comes to esports, but the biggest tournament would be held at QuakeCon, which was pretty much attended only by fans of id Software games. Over the years, id Software as a whole would have an identity crisis as its biggest games tried to adapt to the changing video game market with very little success. Both Quake and Doom would fall into the shadow of emerging titles such as COD and Halo. This would subsequently lead to the death of competitive Quake, as people just simply flocked to other games. The irony now is that a few competitive shooter games, namely Warzone and Apex Legends, thrive on their movement mechanics. I'm telling you, these communities of games would love Quake, but they're all like, no, it's too old, it's too unk, bro. I don't play unk games. The next one I'll talk about, and the first game that comes to my mind when I think of dead esports, is Halo. Halo Combat Evolved was an innovator in the console shooter game genre, introducing numerous features and tropes that are used in shooters to this very day. However, Halo 2 is where it was at. With multiplayer becoming more prominent thanks to Xbox Live matchmaking and the overall gameplay of Halo 1 being overhauled and smoothed out, making for a much more AAA experience, Halo 2 would boom in popularity when it came to the competitive gaming scene. This was also in part to Halo 2 being one of the first games that MLG supported, with the Halo 2 Pro Series being the first televised esports event for MLG. Halo 2 was a deeply competitive game, with players creating various tricks that only worked for this game. Some tricks like YYing would carry over into games that we see even to this very day, but others like BXRing were exclusive to Halo. Halo's formula would also be quite unique, as every player had the same loadout and fought to secure power weapons such as snipers and rocket launchers. These weapons would allow for quicker kills or allow players to block off certain areas of the map simply due to the enemy team knowing they could be sniped or blown up easily. Halo 2 was a turning point for competitive games on console, and this hype was carried over to Halo 3 just with better graphics and an even more streamlined experience. However, Halo Reach would cause a shift in the series, introducing new features that drastically changed the sandbox and removing beloved aspects of the series. After Reach, Bungie cut its ties with Microsoft, and development of Halo games was moved to a new internal studio. Halo 4, similarly to Reach, would add and remove features so drastic that it let down and frustrated the longtime competitors. It was also during this time when Call of Duty forged its identity, and a few big names in the Halo space jumped ship to the more consistent series. Ever since, Halo esports has just not been able to capture the essence of its glory days with Halo 2 and 3. It fell into the shadow of Call of Duty, and furthermore, other games would rise to prominence due to their consistency, such as Counter-Strike. We're going to go back to the early days of esports and talk about the Nintendo World Championships. The Nintendo World Championships were a handful of events held by Nintendo in the 90s that had various gamers step up to the plate to try and complete 3 challenges in 3 different games. It was very simplistic things like, get a certain score in Tetris, and you had to complete all 3 challenges in under 6 minutes. There were multiple age divisions to keep things somewhat fair, and while I said that Quake was one of the first games to have an esports event event for a shooter game, Nintendo World Championships are likely the first ever corporate-funded esport event in general. They did a few of these over the years and then eventually released a game on the Switch that compiled all the challenges from across the numerous events. I guess you could call this one a dead esport, but at the same time, I feel like this might have given birth to the speedrunning scene, which I would consider an esport.
Need a new form of entertainment in your life? Join the thousands of others who have considered subscribing. Side effects may include joy, laughter, and newfound knowledge about video games. Talk to your doctor about if subscribing is right for you.
Let's talk about another Xbox game with a prominent competitive history, and that is Gears of War. Gears of War is a bit like COD in my opinion in that the campaigns are great, but the devs know that the multiplayer is what's carrying the series. Gears of War released in 2005 to pretty much immediate success, and I think with the pre-existing Halo esports scene in play, people kind of just assumed that the same could be done with Gears, to which it was. There wasn't really a gradual build up to the competitive scene, is what I'm getting at. Gears had a smaller community than Halo because it was so different, being a third-person cover shooter. However, various techniques would form that were unique to Gears in the same way that Halo had, such as wall bouncing. Gears of War 1's competitive scene thrived, but Gears 2 and 3 just didn't see the same success. Gears 2 was considered a complete step up from the first game when it came to the campaign, but the multiplayer faced numerous glitches and gameplay changes that ultimately ruined the flow of the gameplay. Halo 3 and the emergence of Call of Duty would also overshadow Gears 2 and 3, and the fourth game would fail to bring the community back, even with little market competition. Epic Games also cut its ties with Microsoft after the third game, but they didn't really go on to make anything really notable, just some game called Fortnite, but I don't really think it got off the ground. Finally, I want to focus on a competitive scene that's actually still around today, but just not at all in the same form. Call of Duty had a legendary competitive run in the mid-2010s, with some of gaming's most iconic e-athletes. Is that the word? Is that what they're called? E-athletes? Some of gaming's most iconic e-athletes would emerge from the Black Ops 2 days. Scump, Nadeshot, Clayster, just some real big names. For the longest time, COD esports was handled by MLG, and allowed for any teams to enter into the tournaments alongside big names like Optic and FaZe. It amassed a gargantuan community that built up its own memorable moments, jokes, and sub-communities.
Good job. If you can get that time, that's huge. Shit, boys! Let's
COD esports would be one of the biggest esports in the scene until Infinite Warfare, where the series would decline in quality, the players were listened to less, and interest would fade. Then in 2019, things got worse. With MLG going under, COD switched to a franchise league, where a tiny pool of teams had to buy into the league for hundreds of thousands of dollars. This left the competitive scene feeling a lot tinier, with the smaller teams that weren't on the scale of something like Optic, but far from amateur, were being shunned out. There was an amateur league, which some of these, let's call them AA teams, moved to. However, COD esports didn't really promote these streams and had some really good players not given the chances that they could have had with a more open tournament structure. With the move to a franchise league, it also caused the elements of community that I mentioned earlier to be very clean, forced, and lacking in character. These moments and jokes weren't really created by fans and players anymore, they were sort of handpicked by the corporate marketing team. With the shift to the franchise league, it also just left matches feeling pretty boring. The same teams playing against each other over and over just wasn't really as interesting. On top of that, these teams are just not that memorable. I want to cheer for FaZe, not the London Royal Ravens. Again, it circulates back to that idea of the league forcing elements of community onto the fans and players. Optic and FaZe weren't just popular because they were good, but because they were brands that were forged by people who play games. They weren't shitty attempts at cool names by a round table of suits in a board meeting. Even further is the way that players have been treated by the league, with predatory contracts that silence their frustrations and complaints about the game or the league itself. It all feels more like a show than a sport. Sorry I put a little bit more effort into the last one. COD just means a lot to me, and yeah, I am one of the people that is pissed with the direction that the competitive league has gone. But that was just a handful of esports scenes that have unfortunately been left in the dust. If you want to see another video like this, leave a like and let me know in the comments because I could absolutely find more to talk about.